Sports don't get much higher stakes than the Kentucky Derby, but what do you really know about the weird, dark history behind America's biggest horse race? Back in the early 19th century, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, at the behest of President Thomas Jefferson, got a bunch of guys together to explore the American wilderness. Along the way, they mostly made a bunch of maps and tried to convince indigenous people that colonialism was actually kind of groovy. 70 years later, Clark's grandson, Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., made his own mark on history by founding a horse race, one that people are still watching today.
A photo finish to decide the 150th Kentucky Derby.
Clark the Younger not only founded the Kentucky Derby, but also built Churchill Downs, though neither one of those ideas was especially original. In fact, Clark had basically just decided to imitate Epsom Downs in England, which is home to a nearly century-old race called the Derby Stakes. Interestingly, the word Derby hasn't always been a synonym for horse race. The Derby Stakes had been named after the 12th Earl of Derby. As well as stealing the name from Derby Stakes, Clark also used its length and rules of entry for his own race. 1.5 miles long, 3-year-old horses only. Luckily, nobody seemed to mind Clark taking inspiration from the English. For his part, the actual 12th Earl of Derby had died about 40 years earlier. According to legend, roses became the official flower of the Kentucky Derby back in 1883 at an after-party thrown by New York socialite Evander Barry Wall, a man known to many as King of the Dudes.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
It's probably worth pointing out that back then, the term dude was used to denote a person who was much too concerned with dressing fancy. The King of the Dudes liked to throw parties and impress women, and at this particular party, he decided to pass out roses to all the ladies present. Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. was at the party too, and he was so impressed by the ladies' reaction to their gifts that he decided to make roses the official flower of the Kentucky Derby. This is also the reason why the winning horse is now draped with a blanket of roses. By the mid-1890s, Churchill Downs had become something of a money pit. In 1894, the track was bought out by a group of investors who failed to make it profitable. They sold it to another group of investors in 1902. One of those later investors was a successful tailor named Matt Wynn. Wynn was largely responsible for reviving the nearly bankrupt Derby, a feat he pulled off by changing the whole vibe of the race. Wynn launched a publicity campaign designed to appeal to folks who longed for the South's antebellum era, back when women had worn big hoop skirts and back when slavery was still legal. There must have been a market for that sort of thing too, because Wynn's campaign worked a treat. Soon after, the Derby became the strange costume party that it still is today, with guests turning up in ridiculous hats and knocking back mint juleps.
Pretty good. I definitely have another one.
There were 15 horses and 15 jockeys in the first Kentucky Derby, and 13 of those jockeys were black. In fact, for a long time, black jockeys dominated the sport, and racetracks were relatively well integrated as far back as the 1880s. By the 1890s, however, racism had begun to turn the Derby into a hostile place, and black riders were starting to feel a lot less welcome. There isn't really any official record of what led to the disappearance of black jockeys, but a reporter for the New York Times once recounted gossip that white jockeys had, in his words, organized to draw the color line. This basically means that the white jockeys asked horse owners and other influential people to shut black riders out of the sport. The reporter even implied that white jockeys had actively sabotaged their black counterparts. He wrote, "Somehow or other, they met with all sorts of accidents and interference in their races. The doubting horse owners seem to have been convinced that if they want to win races, they must ride the white jockeys." Odds makers use a kind of formula that helps them decide which horses have the best chance of winning, but it's not as simple as just plugging some data in a computer. In many ways, odds making depends on the subjective analysis of human beings. Horse and racing experts are all asked for their input, while the odds also take account of variables such as public opinion or the way in which each horse runs. And while odds making is more of a science now than it used to be, the odds makers do often get it wrong. In 2022, Rich Strike was given 80-1 odds at the Derby and won. Entered into the race at short notice after another horse was unable to run, Strike had only competed in 7 races in his life. To the astonishment of the crowd, the horse came up from behind, thundering through the leading pack, winning the race in just over 2 minutes.
Rich Strike is coming up on the inside! Oh my goodness! The longest shot has won the Kentucky Derby!
But even those odds don't match those of Donerail, which began the 1913 Derby with 91-1 odds and won. As of 2024, Donerail still holds the record for the longest long shot to ever win the Kentucky Derby. For the first 21 years of the Kentucky Derby's existence, the race was a grueling 1.5 miles long. Today, though, only the Belmont Stakes is that long. As the final leg of the Triple Crown, that's the longest race that any thoroughbred racehorse is likely to run in its career. In 1896, it finally dawned on someone that maybe 1.5 miles was too much to ask of thoroughbreds that were barely past their 3rd birthdays, and so the distance was dialed back to 1.25 miles, which is the length it remains today. That change in distance is evident if you look back at the winning times across the race's history. Before 1896, these times rarely surpassed 2 minutes 37 seconds. Today, winners usually finish the race in an average of just over 2 minutes, a number that has remained much the same for many decades. Over the long history of the Kentucky Derby, most of the winning horses were bred in the state of Kentucky. That's probably not all that surprising, since both horse breeding and racing are both kind of a big deal in the bluegrass state, so it's really a numbers game more than anything. Horses that aren't Kentucky bred do sometimes win the Derby, if not often. Florida, for example, has contributed 6 winners, and California and Virginia have each contributed 4. It's even less common for horses born outside of the United States to win. In 1917, British-born Omar Khayyam won the race, but a non-U.S. native didn't win again until 1959, when British-born Tommy Lee finished first. 2 Canadian horses have also broken the nationality barrier, but none since 1983. To be fair, Kentucky-bred horses might benefit from one advantage. The Kentucky Horse Racing Commission provides millions of dollars in incentives to local horses that win races. In 2024 alone, the program made $20 million available to Kentucky breeders, and only Kentucky breeders. Everyone knows Secretariat holds the fastest Derby record. At 1 minute 59.40 seconds, no other horse has ever come close to beating the legendary thoroughbred.
Went away to win this race, and he won it with authority.
But who has the slowest win? In 1908, Stone Street finished the race at 2 minutes 15.20 seconds, a whopping 16 seconds slower than Secretariat. Today, he still holds the record as the slowest Derby winner of all time, or at least since 1896, when the race was first shortened to 1.25 miles. To be fair, the track was muddy and horses don't always run that well in those conditions, so Stone Street at least had an excuse for its slow victory. If you want to count the horses that ran the race when it was still 1.5 miles, the honor of the slowest ever win goes to Kingman, who finished at 2 minutes 52.25 seconds in 1891. Unbeknownst to each other, all 4 jockeys in that year's running had each been told to take it easy for the first mile, making for a bizarrely sluggish beginning to the race. It's tempting to assume that greatness might beget greatness, but Nepo babies aren't really a thing in the world of horse racing. You certainly can't guarantee that a horse will win the Kentucky Derby just because it was sired from a previous winner. A lot of different factors make a horse great, and it's about more than mere genetics. You also need to account for training, the jockey's skill, and even how much money the horse has got behind it. Just to prove this point, in the 150-year history of the Kentucky Derby, only 12 winners have gone on to sire other winners. Even the great Secretariat failed to produce any notable sons or daughters. Not one of his 600 foals went on to enjoy an especially impressive racing career. It seems strange that female jockeys are so badly underrepresented in the Kentucky Derby because women have many natural qualities that make them well suited to the job. For example, jockeys tend to be small, and there are many more small women than small men. Women also tend to be more drawn to horses than men. American horse owners and managers are far more likely to be women. Women also tend to be excellent riders and athletes, and there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be better represented at horse races like the Kentucky Derby, and yet they aren't. The first woman to ride in the Kentucky Derby was Diane Crump in 1969, and the male jockeys at the time were about as happy about her participation as you might imagine. None of their predictions about her fitness to compete turned out to be true, of course, but since then, the numbers of women in the Derby have remained shamefully small. In total, only 6 other women have ridden in the race. The reason for this is relatively simple. Women just aren't given as many opportunities to compete as men. If the field were more even, it's highly unlikely the Kentucky Derby's winner's circle would be so male-dominated.
Well, if I knew it was going to be really, really rainy, I would look to see for the horses that have shown they can handle the mud or have pedigrees.
If you've ever been to Kentucky, you probably know that the weather there is pretty okay. Summer temperatures range in the high 80s, and winter temperatures drop down to the 20s. That makes the bluegrass state a good place to have a horse race, especially since average temperatures in May usually land in the mid-70s. Mother Nature doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to averages, though. Historically, the temperatures on Derby Day have ranged from a high of 94 degrees to a low of 36. Temperature alone isn't usually enough to red or green light a sporting event like the Kentucky Derby, but you might imagine that rain would be. And yet, the Kentucky Derby has never once been canceled due to rain, or for any other reason, in fact. Stone Street's infamously slow 1891 race was run on a muddy track, and more than 3 inches of rain came down during the 2018 running, making it the wettest race on record. Still, the race went on despite the torrential downpour. Justify won that wettest of all Derby races with a so-so time of 2 minutes 4.20 seconds. Most athletes are at least a little superstitious, and a few athletes are really superstitious. Horse racing, for whatever reason, seems to be one of the more superstitious sports out there. For example, the color green is largely thought of as unlucky in racing circles. Some racing superstitions have at least a little basis in fact. Post number 1 is considered to be one of the most unlucky posts in a race, but that's at least partly because a horse that breaks from that position tends to get crowded on the inside of the track. Posts 2, 9, 12, 14, and 17 are believed to be even less lucky, however, while post 5 is said to be one of the luckiest. In total, 10 horses breaking from post 5 have gone on to win the Derby. It's not clear why, although it might have something to do with the fact that there haven't been enough Derbies to provide a decent statistical picture of the benefits of riding out of each particular gate. Or, maybe it's magic.